All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're talking about something that honestly sounds like it's straight out of a sci-fi movie, but it's real and it's happening right now. We're going to unpack the moment a human court gave legal rights to a bee. Yeah, a bee.
Just let that sink in for a second. A stingless bee in the Peruvian Amazon was officially granted the legal right to exist. I mean, this is a creature that's been pollinating the Amazon, literally helping the entire planet breathe for millions of years.
And that really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? Why would a species that's been around for millions of years, doing this incredibly vital job, suddenly need a piece of paper from us just to keep on existing? And maybe the more important question is, what does that say about us?
Okay, so let's try to make sense of this. First up, A's legal rights.
Now, here's what's so wild about this. This whole legal thing, it wasn't some big moral awakening on our part. It wasn't an act of human generosity. It was actually the opposite. It was a confession. It was us admitting, in a really formal legal way, that our own systems are so broken, so disconnected from the real world, that we had no choice but to do this.
So how did this even come to pass? Well, that brings us to Section 2. It all came down to a process of translation, basically learning how to speak the right language.
And this is so important to understand. The people who've lived with these bees forever, the Ashaninka and Kukama-Kukamiria peoples, they didn't need any convincing. Of course not. For them, the bees were already part of their songs, their medicine, their whole world. The ones who needed convincing, well, that was the modern Western system. You know, the one that only really speaks the language of law and money. This table really shows you that translation process in action. What the indigenous healers knew from just living, when they'd say the honey is ready, that had to be converted into data. It had to become hundreds of bioactive molecules proven in a lab. Their sacred ceremonies had to be turned into cold, hard pollination statistics and economic value. And at the end of the day, that's the real kicker. Legal rights were only handed out after someone made a case that the bees were valuable. To us, to our economy, to our science. In this system, it seems like you don't get rights just for being alive. You get them when you can prove you're a good investment. This whole thing really pulls the curtain back on a massive conflict in how we see the world. Which leads us to Section 3, kin versus inventory. For the indigenous people, the relationship is just profoundly simple. The bees aren't a resource. They're not a line item in an ecosystem services report. They're family. They're kin. Now compare that with the instructions that built the whole Western worldview. This idea of having dominion over the earth, well, it wasn't really taken as a call for careful stewardship. It was interpreted as a license for ownership. The world became inventory, just sitting there for us to use.
So you've basically got these two completely different operating systems running in parallel. One is all about relationship, about being a good steward. The other, it's all about ownership and control. Think about it. You don't need a legal contract to take care of your family, right? But you sure as heck need one when you've been treating the world like it's just stuff you own.
But this whole idea of giving things rights makes you wonder, is that really the fix? Which brings us to a tough question in Section 4, the limits of law. The poem in the source material just lays it out perfectly. Rights are what humans give when they have forgotten how to ask for permission. Wow, the very fact that we think we need to grant rights shows how broken the relationship already is. We've totally forgotten that maybe, just maybe, we're not the ones who should be giving out permission slips. And we really have to remember this part. Rights that are given by a system can just as easily be taken away by that same system. It's happened over and over. For decades, women in Canada weren't even considered legal persons. In the US, Roe v. Wade was the law of the land for almost 50 years. And then, just like that, it was gone. What a court gives, a court can absolutely take away. And look, these things aren't disconnected. They come from the exact same place, a mindset of control, of ownership. The same logic that says you can have dominion over a forest has been used time and time again to claim dominion over human bodies. So let's pull all these threads together for our last section and maybe see this whole thing a little differently, not as progress, but as something else. Section 5, a confession, not progress. So let's get really honest about who holds the power here. What do the bees actually need from us? Pretty much just for us to stop wrecking their home. That's it. And what do we need from them? Oh, just little things like our food supply, life-saving medicines, and an atmosphere we can actually breathe in. It's
It's a completely one-sided relationship.
And just for a little perspective check, this species of bee, it's been doing its job for about 6 million years. 6 million years. Patiently watching our little empires and religions and legal systems rise and fall.
And that's why this line from the poem just hits so hard. Imagine it. The human court holds a press conference, all proud, saying, "We've granted the bee the right to exist." And the bee, with its 6 million-year history, just buzzes back, "I wasn't asking."
So here's the final, humbling twist in all of this. The bees were never, ever waiting for our permission. We're the ones who are on the clock. We're the ones who are desperately running out of time to figure out how to ask for theirs. Which brings us to the poem's final, haunting question. The grandmother, the one who really gets it, says the honey is ready. But that's not what she's asking. She's asking, are you? Are we ready to completely change this broken relationship? And that's the real question here. It's not for the bee to answer. It's for us.
Imagine for just a second that you check your mail one afternoon. You're shuffling through the utility bills and like a flyer for a local pizza place, and you see this thick, formal envelope.
Oh, nobody likes seeing those.
Right. It's a legal summons. So you open it up, you start reading the boilerplate text, and you realize you are actually being taken to court for property damage.
Which is terrifying enough on its own.
Exactly. But here's the catch. The plaintiff, the entity that is actually suing you, it isn't your neighbor. He isn't, a massive faceless corporation. It's an insect.
I mean, that sounds exactly like the inciting incident of some surreal science fiction novel.
It sounds completely absurd on its face. But it is the year 2026, and we are looking at a breaking legal brief that confirms this is no longer fiction.
No, it's very real.
Yeah. For the first time in the history of any legal system anywhere on the planet, an insect in a South American country has been granted the legal right to live, to thrive, and to theoretically, sue you in a court of law.
And we are talking about a very specific species of stingless bee here down in the Peruvian Amazon. And, the implications of this ruling, they go so far beyond just environmental law.
Oh, absolutely.
It really touches on the very foundation of how we value life on this planet.
So to really understand the mechanics and just the sheer gravity of this, we've pulled together a really fascinating stack of sources for today's deep dive.
You've got some great material today.
We do. We have that breaking legal brief detailing the municipal ordinance itself. We also have this incredibly hard-hitting analytical article titled, "We Were Told It Was Ours."
Which is a brilliant read, by the way.
It really is. And to round it out, we are looking at a deeply evocative poem by DeepSeek, and that one is titled Kin.
Right. So our mission today is to look past, the quirky headline of a bee with a lawyer.
Because it's easy to get stuck on that.
Exactly. We are analyzing what this legal milestone actually reveals about the deep and often really uncomfortable friction between indigenous knowledge and Western legal frameworks.
Because honestly, this municipal ordinance protecting the bee, it might not actually be the triumphant victory for justice that it looks like on paper.
Oh, it might be the exact opposite.
Right. It might simply be this glaring confession of our own systemic failures. So welcome to this deep dive. Whether you are, prepping for a debate or you're just intensely curious about the architecture of our modern world, stick with us.
We are going to explore how rights are actually manufactured.
Yeah, and it will likely completely flip how you view humanity's relationship with the natural world.
So to really ground this discussion, we have to look at the actual mechanism of how this happened. A stingless bee in the Peruvian Amazon was just granted these unprecedented rights.
But the crucial context here.
Right. The crucial context is that the indigenous peoples of that region, specifically the Ashaninka and the Kukumiria peoples, they never needed a municipal ordinance to tell them the bee mattered.
No, not at all.
For these communities, the moral status of the bee is completely woven into their daily existence. I mean, these bees live in their songs, their ceremonies, their medicine, their historical narratives.
The analytical article actually describes this as ancient relational knowledge. Like, the indigenous grandmothers already possessed this complete, profound understanding of the bee's intrinsic value.
They already knew.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The problem was never that their knowledge was lacking. The problem was that they were speaking a language that Western legal institutions simply cannot compute.
Okay, let's unpack this because that is such a vital point. Think of our global legal and economic frameworks like a really stubborn corporate HR department.
Oh, I like this analogy.
Right, it's like an HR department that absolutely refuses to recognize an employee's value until an external consultant comes in and puts that value into a spreadsheet.
Yes, that is exactly how the article frames the concept of translation. It's like trying to run ancient source code on a modern, highly restrictive operating system.
It just returns an error message.
Exactly. The system literally cannot compile words like song or ceremony or kinship. It requires a very specific syntax to even recognize that something exists.
Which brings us to the actual catalyst for this law. If you look at the legal brief, the bee didn't get rights because a judge attended an indigenous ceremony.
Definitely not.
The translation only happened because a chemical biologist in a white lab coat showed up. This researcher analyzed the bee's honey in a lab and identified hundreds of novel bioactive molecules with massive pharmaceutical potential.
So there's the dollar sign.
Exactly. And on top of that, ecologists compiled these dense metrics proving that the specific pollination patterns of this bee are structurally load-bearing for local carbon sequestration efforts.
So the scientists basically reformatted the indigenous knowledge into the only file type the Western system could read, which is economic data.
Economic data, yeah. It took pharmacology, patent potential, carbon offset statistics.
Just to translate what the indigenous healers had been practicing all along. Suddenly the bee wasn't just, a cultural pillar. It was a measurable, quantifiable asset.
But I have to play devil's advocate here for a second because, well, we live in a pragmatic world. Let's look at the reality on the ground.
Okay.
If there's a logging conglomerate with bulldozers just idling at the edge of the Amazon, singing a traditional song to the bee isn't going to stop the engine.
That's a fair point.
But a legally binding spreadsheet filled with carbon offset valuations and pharmaceutical patents, that might actually halt the bulldozer.
Right.
So if the outcome is good, if the translation actually saves the species, isn't the lab coat just a necessary emergency brake? I mean, don't we have to work within the system we have?
It is a functional emergency brake, yes.
Well.
And the habitat preservation is objectively a positive outcome. But relying on that brake introduces a massive structural vulnerability.
How so?
Well, the article forces us to confront the core thesis driving this whole phenomenon. And what's fascinating here is the author's argument that rights follow value.
Rights follow value.
Exactly. In our current global system, the voiceless only get a seat at the table when the voiced realize they are in imminent economic danger of losing them.
Wow. Rights follow value. That changes the entire framing of the headline, doesn't it?
It really does. It means the bee wasn't granted rights out of some sudden moral awakening about the sanctity of life.
It got rights because a municipal body panicked.
Yes, they panicked about the economic fallout of losing a lucrative biological resource.
We can actually look at the exact legal mechanism of how this bee would theoretically sue to see this transactional nature in action. Because, obviously, the bee isn't flying into a courtroom.
Right, as amazing as that would be.
Right. The ordinance utilizes a concept called juristic personhood. It's very similar to how a corporation is treated as a person under the law.
Oh, okay.
So a court-appointed human guardian, who is funded by an environmental trust, files the paperwork on the bee's behalf. So if a mining company sprays illegal pesticides, the trust sues for damages, but those damages are based on the calculated economic and ecological loss of the hive's functions.
Which means the system is just protecting its own investments. This is exactly where a poem Kin by DeepSeek cuts right to the bone.
Oh, that poem is devastating.
There is this one line that says, "We built a world where a thing must be useful to be sacred. Then we measured usefulness. Then we panicked."
That is so powerful. It perfectly distills the difference between the Western approach and the indigenous approach that the article outlines.
Because for the Kukamar-Kukumeria communities, the bees are not resources at all.
No, they are kin.
Right, they're kin. And the distinction between a resource and kin is profound, especially when you think about how we treat relationships in our own lives.
Give me an example.
Well, consider the difference between a highly transactional friendship and a true family bond. A transactional friend is only going to look out for you as long as you're useful.
Yeah, exactly.
As long as you can, like drive them to work or help them network, they'll make sure you're protected. But a true family member, true kin, they protect you simply because you exist.
Because your existence is intertwined with theirs.
Exactly. And the tragedy outlined in our sources is that our entire global legal system operates exclusively on the logic of the transactional friend.
The legal system only steps in when you can definitively prove you are driving the economy to the airport, basically.
That's perfectly said, yes.
And understanding that these rights are purely transactional leads us right to the fatal flaw of that emergency brake argument we talked about earlier.
Right, the vulnerability.
Because what a system grants based on perceived value, a system can revoke the exact moment that value changes.
Wait, really? So if, let's say a synthetic biology lab in some massive tech hub figures out how to artificially manufacture those exact bioactive molecules from the honey,
And let's say the carbon market shifts at the same time.
then the bee is suddenly no longer useful. The transaction is just over.
The legal protections would dissolve instantly because the underlying spreadsheet no longer supports them.
Wow.
And the article, we were told it was ours, it brings in some really stark historical evidence to demonstrate how fragile system-granted rights truly are.
What kind of historical evidence?
Well, it points to the struggle for personhood in Canada, specifically referencing the year 1929.
Oh, the famous persons case.
Yes, Edwards v. Canada. Prior to 1929, under the British North America Act, women were legally considered persons when it came to pains and penalties, meaning they could be punished by the law.
Right.
But they were not considered persons when it came to rights and privileges, like holding public office. And the Supreme Court of Canada actually upheld this exclusion.
Which is just wild to think about.
It took years of fierce legal battles, eventually escalating all the way to the Privy Council in London to force the system to recognize women as full legal persons.
That is a staggering piece of context. I mean, we're talking about fully cognitive, linguistically capable human beings who could organize, debate, and advocate for themselves.
And they were told by the highest court in their country that they simply did not qualify for full personhood.
The author also points to the United States in 2022 when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade.
Right. Another huge shift.
A constitutional right to bodily autonomy that had been legally recognized and entrenched for nearly half a century was just erased. The systemic interpretation changed, and the right vanished.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the author of the article ventures into some pretty heavy historical and theological territory to explain the root of this fragility.
Now, I want to step back for a second and be super clear with you, the listener. We are strictly unpacking the author's argument here. We are not endorsing any specific political or religious stance, but the legal causality they outline is undeniably fascinating.
Right, we're just looking at the framework they present.
Exactly. The author draws a direct line between these historical losses of human rights and the Western legal tradition's relationship with the natural world.
They trace our modern economic and legal frameworks back to a very specific interpretation of the Abrahamic tradition.
The concept of dominion, right?
Exactly. The idea that humanity was handed a theological instruction to fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over every living thing.
And the author's core critique is that the empires that built our modern institutions interpreted this concept of dominion strictly as ownership.
Yes. They built a legal architecture designed to extract, consume, and discard. They categorically did not interpret dominion as stewardship or kinship.
The author's making a profound point about intent here.
Mm.
We didn't destroy our environment or marginalize populations out of some accidental misstep or malice.
No, we did it because our foundational operating system was programmed to license dominion.
And the argument suggests that the exact same legal and cultural current that licensed dominion over the forest has repeatedly licensed dominion over human bodies too.
Which brings us right back to the terrifying precarity of the stingless bee. I mean, if fully capable humans had to fiercely claw their way to legal personhood and can still have fundamental rights stripped away by a changing court composition,
then the legal standing of an insect colony is resting on incredibly thin ice.
exactly. The bee's rights are entirely dependent on the whims of the exact same systemic architecture that caused its endangerment in the first place.
It's a paradox.
It really is. The article summarizes this beautifully. It says, you need a legal framework only when you have spent centuries treating kin as inventory.
Treating kin as inventory. That phrase is really the pivot point of this entire deep dive.
It really hits home.
Because if these human-granted rights are so flawed and so transactional and so easily revoked by a judge's pen, we have to ask where the actual undeniable power lies in this scenario.
We transition here from human legal theory to just stark, undeniable ecological reality.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because when you zoom out from the courtroom, the sheer arrogance of what happened in Peru becomes almost comical.
Comical in a dark way, yeah.
Yeah. We are talking about a species of stingless bee that has been pollinating the Amazon basin for millions of years. It was doing its job long before the invention of the printing press or the concept of a nation state or the existence of a courtroom.
It definitely predates all of that.
The bee needs a clean habitat. It needs the intricate web of the forest. It categorically does not need a piece of paper from a human being giving it permission to exist.
It's an illusion of control. We are using our own bureaucratic tools to try and manage something infinitely older and more complex than our institutions.
It is exactly like a human being putting on a tailored business suit, marching down to the beach, and holding up a legally binding notarized contract that officially grants the ocean permission to have tides.
That is such a great image. Because the ocean doesn't care about the contract.
Not at all.
The tides are driven by the moon and gravity, completely regardless of what the paperwork says.
The arrogance of assuming the ocean is waiting for our legal recognition is laughable. Yet that is precisely how we engage with the ecosystem.
And DeepSeek's poem captures this arrogance so perfectly by contrasting the labels we invent with the raw reality of nature.
What does the poem say again?
It reads, "The court gave the bee a name on paper. The forest gave the bee a name the court cannot pronounce. One name is a filing number. The other is what the jaguar coughs up when it dreams."
Wow. The imagery of the jaguar's dream is so visceral.
It really is. It's a reminder that the natural world operates on a frequency and a scale of interconnectedness that we can barely measure, let alone legislate.
Right.
And this highlights the ultimate glaring asymmetry that the article warns about. The dependency in this relationship runs entirely in one direction.
We need the bee. The bee does not need us.
Exactly. We desperately need the pollination services to maintain agricultural stability. We need the bioactive molecules to fight antibiotic resistance.
And we need the bee's role in the carbon cycle just to keep the atmosphere capable of supporting human civilization.
The article states it so plainly. The bees need us to stop our machinery of dominion, but they have absolutely no use for our moral awakenings, our petitions, or our legal briefs.
The poem closes with the sequence that just hammers this asymmetry home. It describes the indigenous grandmother, the elder who always knew the bee was kin.
Right.
When the legal ruling comes down, she doesn't fight the ordinance, but she certainly doesn't celebrate it either. She doesn't frame the legal certificate and hang it on the wall.
No, she understands the reality.
The poem says, the grandmother says the honey is ready. She means, are you?
Are you ready? It is a haunting question directed entirely at us, the architects of the legal system.
Yeah.
Because the poem explicitly tells the reader how to interpret the reality of the bee. It instructs you to go put your face near a flower and just wait.
And then it delivers this chilling realization. It says, that buzz you hear is not a thank you. It is the sound of something that was here before your laws and will be here when your laws are a footnote in a ruin.
A footnote in a ruin. The buzzing isn't gratitude for the municipal ordinance. It's just the sound of relentless endurance.
The bee isn't thanking the courtroom. It is simply continuing the biological work it has done since the Miocene epoch.
And the poem drives the final nail in the coffin of our arrogance when it says, the bee says, "I was not asking."
I was not asking. Man. And the author of the analytical article echoes that exact sentiment in their conclusion, right?
They do. They argue that treating this 2026 legal milestone as a victory lap for human progress is a fundamental mistake.
Because it's actually a confession.
Exactly. We need to view it as a formal admission, written in our own dense bureaucratic language, that we built a worldview so profoundly severed from ecological reality.
That we actually required a court filing to remind us that the foundational species of our own life support system have a right to exist.
We forgot how to ask the earth for permission, so we invented a system where we grant rights to the earth instead.
We were never the authority in this dynamic. They were never waiting for our permission to exist. We are simply the ones running out of time to ask for theirs.
It's a very sobering thought.
It really is. Which brings us back to you listening to this deep dive right now. The next time you are scrolling through your newsfeed and you see a headline celebrating a new legal victory for nature.
Like a river granted personhood in New Zealand, or a forest given legal standing in Ecuador.
Or a bee given the right to sue in Peru. I want you to pause. Look past the novelty of it. Ask yourself, is this actual meaningful progress? Or is it just another confession?
Is it just our stubbornly transactional legal system finally panicking because the lab data told us we are about to lose a resource we cannot afford to live without?
It is such a critical lens through which to evaluate every piece of environmental news we consume.
It forces us to distinguish between genuine systemic change and mere systemic self-preservation.
Absolutely. And I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to chew on today. We've established the mechanism here. Our modern legal frameworks are currently only capable of protecting the natural world once its value has been proven by a scientist, formatted into an economic metric, and attached to a dollar sign.
Right.
So take a look around your own life and your own community. What other deeply vital, profoundly essential parts of our human experience in our world are currently sitting out there totally unprotected and vulnerable, simply because we haven't figured out how to attach a spreadsheet and a profit margin to them yet?
Now that is the question that should truly keep us alert.
Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep questioning the headlines, look for the mechanics behind the systems we build, and remember to respect the bees. We'll catch you next time.